Okay. Hi. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Christina Joy. This is Sankofa Video Books and Cafe, and we're about to have an event. Welcome to everyone here at Sankofa. We've been here for 26 years. We were opened in 1997, and we were started by Haile and Shirikiana Garima, who are filmmakers. They made the film Sankofa, which came out in 1993, and here you are in the legacy of that film. If you haven't watched Sankofa the movie, it's on Netflix, and y'all should watch it. Um, but tonight, we are here for a, a lovely event with a lovely set of brothers right here. I just I want to pat myself on the back, first of all, for getting both of these two amazing brothers on stage together. Like, can y'all clap it up for that? Okay, like, so tonight you all are here for Gabriel Gaius Biode. He is a 24-year-old Yoruba indie author raised in Columbus, Ohio, with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Dayton, where he was the president of Black Action Through Unity and vice president of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated Gamma Theta chapter. He recently published the book we're all here to discuss, his debut poetry book, When You Get Older, a psychological adventure of an uncle that loses his faith in God when he witnesses the tragic effects of his brother losing custody of his daughter. Tonight, Gabriel will be interviewed by Drew Anderson. He's the co-founder of Spit Dat DC, the longest running open mic series in the city. And without further ado, I will have these brothers take it away.
All right. Thank you, Christina. And thank you all for coming out in support of a Black author, a brilliant brother, an outstanding poet, and a very vulnerable, very relevant story about family, about community, about unpacking trauma and healing in, centering ways. So, wow. Having read this book, I have to say I've read it and then I haven't, because I've read it cover to cover. But poetry, I feel like you haven't really read a poetry book until you've read it at least twice. Because poetry reveals itself, as you know, line for line, and then in the context of the poem, and then in the context of all the poems in the book. To really have felt like you really read it, I think you need to read a poetry book at least twice. So I've read it and then I haven't. But I feel like I've got the author, so that's as good as the second read, because I get to ask some questions about that first read. So, for starters, so much to ask. Wow. First of all, I understand you graduated from the fine university across the street there, perhaps?
Not a graduate, student.
Okay. Fair enough. My word is fine. All right. A student of Howard University. All right. As was I. Old school. When I was at Howard, I had hair like yours.
I'm scared now.
but back in the days, but yeah, I know something about the legacy of the artists that come from that space. And I saw in a previous interview of yours that you spoke about how your transition at Howard was not so smooth.
Yeah.
And but you didn't expound. So I wondered if you would care to expound here.
Yeah, absolutely. My Howard experience, or deciding to go to Howard after it's in the PWI University of Dayton, I think was a wise decision. One, because I'd already been exposed to life at a predominantly white institution, and I wanted to take my knowledge and my passion that I feel like I really discovered to a HBC, trying to contribute now that I have the knowledge and the resources that I have. However, you can kind of infatuate the experience based off of the reputation and not the reality of not only certain living conditions, but also how people may operate with a certain mentality that doesn't value Blackness in the way that you do. So kind of transitioning into the space, there was, the organization was lacking a lot. I didn't get a lot of emails. I was trying to reach out to people not picking up phones. So I'm an ambitious individual, kind of fearless for better or worse. So I was just like, I'm just gonna pull up and I'm just gonna figure it out. And that usually kind of works itself out. But I hit a moment where it wasn't really working itself out. And that was a different experience. That really challenged me for real, and interacting and engaging in spaces where it's like, why are you being a barrier in front of me? Like, shouldn't you have to, coming from an institution that I've come from, it's like, shouldn't you have the realization that we in this together? Like, and why are you making it so hard for me to matriculate into this institution that I've done my research of? I'm not just pulling up randomly. Like, I know a little bit about the history, and I'm making this endeavor not just for myself. I mean, a lot of it definitely is for myself, but also like I want to contribute to us in different and dynamic ways in our educational space. So it was very emotionally triggering because I expected so much, but didn't get that in return. And I also was alone out here. So on top of that, it was just it was rough, very rough. I had to find home.
Find home.
Yeah.
I feel that. And you speak on finding home in here, and we're going to get there.
Yeah.
I always like to ask writers about their influences. In the acknowledgments, you do name some poets who have inspired you, but you end by, as a writer should, saying, and many more, or something to that effect. So I'd like to know about some of those many more, since we're here surrounded by all these brilliant words. Who are some of your influences as a writer?
All right, real quick, before I even get into it, especially because this is Sankofa, I want us to all collectively take a deep breath real quick. So let's take a deep breath right now. Let's take one more. I do that so one, I can relax a little bit. But also, we can collectively I really love Sankofa. This has been, when it comes to like being here, this has been my second home, away from home, to where I come in here and it's like, come as you are, you know. That's something that's expected in a lot of churches. We underestimate the amount of places like this where you can really just show up as yourself. And that's kind of what Black love is all about, in my opinion, at its root, at its core. It should be come as yourself, because there's been so many spaces where you haven't been loved. And that's however way you show up, show up. So, when it comes to being surrounded by a lot of writers and authors, I have this fictional mind to where I kind of visualize them. You know what I'm saying? Looking whether they're still alive or they've passed. I think of writers like James Baldwin. Like James Baldwin, definitely. I think of writers like Jason Reynolds, who's somebody present, that wrote Long Way Down, which is a book I highly recommend. I think of writers like somebody that's underrated, Gwendolyn Brooks, phenomenal Black woman writer that I take a lot from her ability to write but not be straightforward. Really rely on heavy metaphors and you to think about what she's writing and what she's talking about. Um, who's other writers? I know there's a lot of local ones that I mentioned in the back because Amaria Jones, oh snap, somebody that graduated from my alma mater, Amaria Jones, who is a graceful writer. Like she is fantastic, you know what I'm saying? So it's beyond just like people that have come before us or people that have great notoriety. Like there's people that I know that I really pay attention to. Oh, they wrote it like this, or moments like you mentioned to I'm like, dang, why didn't I think of that? There's a poem you wrote, girl, like I forget what it was, but I was like, why didn't I think of that? So um, there's so many different writers, and even beyond like our culture, there's a poem called that I say really inspired this book, which if you watch the movie Interstellar, you'd be familiar with it. Um, but I just call the poem Rage Against the Dying of the Light. That poem is phenomenally written and does such a great job of like channeling your inner resistance towards what we call the dying of the light, and whatnot. So yeah, there's so many writers, so many authors for real.
Okay, much respect.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that we got some fellow authors in the house. It's only fitting. Before I get into the very deep gist of this book, the theme and inspiration of the book, while we're talking about inspirations and influences, I noticed you have a lot of sort of like science fiction kind of or like superhero type references in there. Like there's a reference to Batman, there's a reference to Krypton, there's a reference to and there's something I wanted to check. Well, two-part question. There's a specific thing that I wanted to see if it was a reference and if you meant it the way I pictured it. Because I'm seeing some kind of like fellow black geekdom going on. Like certain things make me feel that, and so there's a poem called "Ignorance is Suffering," and it had. Let me find it. Right. All right. In ignorance is suffering. I'm sorry.
Ignorance is suffocating. Chapter 2 is like the
Oh, okay. Right here. Page 33. The word is bond. You had a part where you said, where the sonic within is blue, like a drowning bubble in your chest that's new. And I pictured Sonic the Hedgehog in that level where he breathes in the bubble and word?
Facts.
Okay,
Facts.
okay. It was just in my mind. Okay. Just, because I was like, am I reading too much into it? Is it?
No, you're not. That's one of those things to where it's like I don't rely heavily on puns too much, but it's because like my goal is to tell a story, right? But you know, we're artists, or you know, maybe not everybody, but anybody that considers themselves an artist, especially in creative writing, like you have fun with what you write, the story you tell about. So Sonic the Hedgehog, when you play the game, he can't swim, and there's like bubbles that like pop up when you play the game that you have to breathe in. And I write this poem titled "Ignorance is Suffocating," where I'm pretty much talking about how everybody's acting like they don't see what's going on, and including myself in some aspect, and how that can feel like you can't breathe, feel like the sonic within is blue. Um, like something in your chest that's new, that's causing you to feel this claustrophobic environment because you, or at least your problems, don't feel seen. So that was an intentional metaphor that I'm glad, because I think this book has layers to it, and people that know are able to experience it and enjoy it on a deeper level, because there are references like that that are personal to me. And that should be kind of the writing process. It should be at least something that I've learned and that I'm trying to start my artist journey off with, my author journey especially, is not try and write to sound um, not try and write to be accepted, but write from an honest place, and let that really be what influences my style. Because if you find your lane and you find your niche, I haven't reached that point yet, but I'm kind of a man of principle. So I believe that if you stick with your niche, there's somebody that's going to be able to connect, you know, with it. It doesn't really matter about trying to fit in. It really matters about adding your star to the space. You know what I'm saying? Not trying to, you'll lose yourself trying to be like everybody else, you know? So this book was one of those ways that I really stuck with being me and staying true to me. And it is a beautiful experience, you know.
It is. And let's get into this beautiful experience. Let's talk about when you get older. For anyone in the audience who may not know what it's about, give them the gist. Give them the overall kind of synopsis, if you would.
Yeah, the premise that I always go with is it's a story about an uncle that loses faith in God when he witnesses his big brother lose custody of his daughter. And he writes this collection of poems for her to read when she gets older, because they're not around each other. So it's like, I can't really tell you what's going on. I really do have to kind of wait till you get older and find a way to trust this information to you, you know what I mean? And that's one of the fundamental things that I guess this book is really about. It's developing that trust, and not just trust, I'm gonna be intentional about faith, because it's less of, you kind of know a little bit more when you trust. You know a lot less when you have faith. And that's really what this book is relying on. It's a faith journey for the author, to where he goes from being this wet behind the ears young boy that just, you know, kind of raised in the church, believes in God, you know, and all this, and kind of your, I don't want to say basic, but I'll say your basic level information on religion. And he gets hit with this thing that just breaks his entire belief system. It crushes it, and he has to pick up the pieces, you know. But the beautiful thing about it with the niece in this is she's what's keeping his faith intact. It's like, if I don't keep you in mind, then I'll go and become somebody that is not healthy for me and is not healthy for you. She reminds him of the love and the man that he needs to be. And that brings him closer to God, which is what makes, I was just asked what's my favorite poem in the book, and I'm going to say Baptized in Fire in the last chapter, Ascension, because it tells that to the niece. Like, there's one line that I think I remember. You know what? I'll just go to it. I'll just go to what we got here.
Because I was gonna say, when we come to a book reading for a poet, we gonna hear some poems, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Hear some bars.
Yeah.
At some point, that was going to happen.
Yeah, I'm not gonna get into it, but I definitely wanna. Yeah, it says, "You taught me how to pray. It was the only thing I knew that kept you close when others kept us far. Perhaps this truth is blasphemous, but this truth is more important than sacrilege. I need you to know. My faith was filled with maggots, smelled of embalming solutions coating a weeping corpse, ashes, urns, and abandoned churches below living temperature thresholds. And this casket of an existence was once my absolute truth." I'm going to read the rest later because it deserves it, but that's like one of my favorite because it's just telling like, you're the reason that I have some belief in God, and that's kind of, I think, something in all of us, it's our humanity and our communities reinstill our faith, and kind of are the bridge between our connection to whatever higher entity we think contributes to like our benevolence just as individuals. So.
When you say, well, first of all, I was snapping up for that guy too. I come from poetry. I host poetry event. I'm used to after brother, sister, or whoever give you the words like that, then we snap it up. When you talk about the niece saving your life, saving your spirit, saving your faith, I mean, that's actual black girl magic. You talk about superheroes. I mentioned Batman and stuff, but in the end, there's a reference there to like a black phoenix, but she's the superhero in this book.
She's the sun.
And when you talk about, there was this one reference you made about like the ROC.
AROC.
The ROC.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Because that comes up again, because there's a poem called the ROC, but then it's, I feel like, referenced later again. And what's the connection with that?
So, all right, so I want to write a fiction series in the future. I'm a natural poet, and I'm going to write as many poetry books as possible until I get to the point where I feel comfortable writing fiction. So this is a way that it's not a traditional poetry book to where it's like a collection of poems. It's an actual story unfolding itself to where, I think you can treat traditional poetry books, or at least modern traditional poetry books, like books of Proverbs, to where you can just open up randomly and you can get something from whatever the author chose to put in there. And that's usually the value of the collection. It's something that stands a test of time because it's something that's in your household that if you pick up, it's going to speak to you. Not to say this isn't that, but I really am trying to tell a chronological story and develop a character to where the uncle, who is the narrator in chapter 1, is not the same person at the end of at the end of the book. That's literally and figuratively. Like figuratively, he's changed, but also literally he's grown. And I use poetry to tell his age throughout the book, like I hint at it through language. So AROC, or something that I had to do, especially in the editing process, is I wanted the connections to be made. So me referencing AROC again, as well as like some other poems that I may reference, is to do those callbacks to let the reader know that this story is developing on top of itself. And some of these poems won't stand on their own because I sacrifice their autonomy for the story, So it's like this poem connects to this, and this metaphor connects to this, and that's how the story has to like grow. You know what I'm saying?
And that's what I mean when I say you got to read a poetry book twice. Because now I want to go back and see those connections you're talking about. Now, you have framed this as a work of fiction, written in verse, but based on true events. And there can be a thin line, as you know. One of my favorite quotes, Margaret Atwood, said something like, when people write fiction, you assume it's autobiography. When people write autobiography, we assume they're lying their ass off. She didn't say ass, but you'll excuse me. But, so, what is the line between, especially for a poet, where we dive into abstraction anyway, what is the line between a fictional work that is based on true events and a straight up autobiographical memoir situation? What is the line in a general sense, and what is the line in this piece?
Man, I want to say the line is choice and intent, but that's a bit vague. I'm gonna say it's that, but I'm also gonna like expound a little bit because I think the author chooses. Because there's some autobiographies where I'm sure there are some sensitive spots that people have like withheld, and as much as I can say like this story is based on my life, you know what I'm saying? There's a lot of points where I withhold, but that's where the intent comes in because there's a story I'm trying to tell that exists outside of me. You know what I'm saying? And I think there are points in this book where it's not, I would say the instances come more from the emotion. So it's less of like, okay, I'm telling, it's like, okay, this may not have happened in real life, but this was how it felt. You know what I'm saying? So I think in autobiographies, it's not just about this is how I felt. It's like this is what happened and you choosing. So in this book, I think the line really is the choice and intent, which isn't a great answer because I do think that's a bit intangible. But that's kind of the best way that I can put into perspective what an author is thinking when they're choosing to write a book. And blur those lines. But to get to more specific, strictly with this book, I think the line in this book is my intent to not characterize the characters. And if I do, which I will do in the sequel probably, is give the characters some level of connection that the reader can leave with. So it's not just the uncle, it's this person, you know. But whereas an autobiography, there's more like, this is who this is at this point in time, this is who this is. So that line is also, when it comes to fiction, is your characters and your world building. Because fiction is really based on world building and creating a universe that somebody can connect to, but as well as characters. Who are the characters? Does it matter that they're real? Because you can also write a fiction book based on real events, but the world that this exists in isn't the same as the one that we live in. So, to where maybe I can add like who's somebody prominent right now? I don't know. I can add another author in this book that really exists, but the events that they exist within didn't happen. So I hope that's good.
It is. I was going to say I disagree with the part when you said it wasn't a great answer. I think it was an honest answer. I think that you spoke to how something is. It may not. The part where you said it may not have been like this, but this is how it felt. I think most writers do that, but they might not frame it like that. They might say, "No, this is how it happened," and conflate their truth with the truth. And the fact that you said it like that shows your humility and your honesty as a writer, because as writers, we are world builders. So you're God. And that's a huge responsibility. And that brings me to my next question. I really wanted something you said, maybe ask another question, but I'm scared I'm going to forget the next question. Remind me to ask you about the connection between being a mechanical engineer, student and teacher of such, and world building. That was the trigger. But when you talked about this being based on real people. All right. So we know that we are in the age of the super fan. You can't just like something. You gotta prove your love. You gotta ride for it. You can't just like Beyonce. You in the hive. You coming for anybody, doxing somebody. So what was, because this was based on sensitive family events, how did you juxtapose your natural right as a writer to speak your truth with perhaps some sense of responsibility of protecting people who inspired the book?
Man, that is a great question. That's scary as well because I know that I'm protective for sure. Like, I mean, the main character is based off of me. Will grow outside of me once I finish this series. Um, but I mean, as if you've read the book, you could probably tell they're very protective. You know what I'm saying? And I am too. So um, we value children. You know what I'm saying, in our family. I'd say that's like a fundamental like value that we all have, which you'd be surprised that's not necessarily everybody. So thinking of my niece as well. You know what I'm saying? Like, because I do actually want my niece for real to read this eventually. Or I don't want. Yeah, I don't want. Um, Once again, if anything I've learned from this book, faith. You know what I'm saying? So there's no huge desire. There's much more trust in kind of whatever direction things go. It's like I'm gonna be here regardless. You know. Um, but I would say before I decided to publish anything, I asked the father's permission. Like, I'm about to write this book on some real shit. You know, obviously, I have my own endeavor as an artist, but like, are you good with this? You know what I mean? Before I just kind of put that out. So, I guess you choose who to prioritize and who has the right to give you the green light. You know what I'm saying? And as far as this story goes, the father who I think I tell some vulnerable stuff about in this book is it's like, yeah, are you good with this? So you choose who has that right to say you can or can't do something, especially if you're writing based off of somebody else's truth or involving somebody or including somebody in your truth. Uh, I definitely think that it's not always going to be the case. Like, you're going to step on toes as an artist, and that's something that this book is also evident of. Like, I'm definitely probably stepping on a few people's toes outside of myself that I just don't know. But being an artist isn't me looking for permission to tell stories. You know, if we did, we wouldn't have half of the stories that we do have. You know, and half of the stories that people need. You know, so you take those creative risks because being an artist is this oxymoron. It's like your ego is in control, but it's also devoid of your ego because of that vulnerability, the carelessness and the selflessness of just telling the truth or whatever the truth is in that moment, you know? So yeah, that's kind of my perspective on that.
I appreciate that word. Man, so the thing about this, well, there's no more than one thing about this book, but the subject matter, obviously, when you hear a synopsis like that, you're like, this is, prepare yourself emotionally, this is about to be sad, you know? And so it can be hard to get through a book that has a subject matter that's kind of heavy. But with your book, the beauty of the poetry, the style and the structure and the creativity made me keep coming back to it. So I read it quickly. I kept, I thought I was gonna be like, all right, let me prepare myself. But I was like, it's a treat for a crafts person, someone who appreciates the craftsmanship of words, the mechanical engineering, if you will, of it. I was like, what he does there with the style of each piece, and they're all different, but you say so many things that make me wish I said them, either because of the style, because of the content, or because of both. And so I just wanted to give you your flowers, so to speak, as a pensmith. So I mean, really, like, this is one of the best books of poetry I've ever read. It really is. Snap it up for this brother. What you did, and it reminds me of something that a young artist said to me one time. I asked them, why do poets always choose to write about what's ugliest? And what he said to me was, because what's beautiful doesn't need to be made beautiful.
Wow.
And I feel like this book speaks to that. You took a situation that was clearly hard hitting, was clearly personal, was clearly, traumatic, and you found a way to make beauty out of what was troubling. And it makes me think of something. In preparation for this interview, I watched another one of your interviews, and you said something about the anger part of the anger phase of grief. And so my question is, what does the anger phase of grief look like personally, collectively, and then how do we get through that? Because I think that some people are so good at the anger part that they stay there.
Yeah.
And we're still seeing a lot of the ramifications of that, especially after the pandemic. So, what is the anger phase personally in the context of this book, in the situations that bred this book?
Yeah.
What is the anger phase communally, and how do we get out of that?
So the anger phase in context of this book happens in chapter 3. that's when kind of everything it's talked about, right? I'm pretty sure it's talked about. I try and give clues on where things are at, right, in the book and what's happening. So in chapter 3, or at the end of chapter 2, the uncle has seen his niece for the first time in 187 days. And the poem is titled 187 Days, but where the last poem is titled Unforgotten, which is kind of this realization that she hasn't forgotten about us. And in the moment of trial, the uncle kind of ran away, or at least used college as a runaway, and escaped from his world falling apart and just being away from all the drama, the BS. But she, when they see each other again, at least the poem is hinting at nothing's changed. And this big fear that he has is like, you probably forgot about us. You probably don't know how I talk about not knowing how to smell, how I touch, forgetting my name, because something that the uncle is facing is, overseas, he forgot how his father smelled, how his father touched, like, forgot his name, his face. So it's like, you see this kind of trauma he's dealing with and projecting that on her. And it's like, she's better in some aspect, um, or at least not having to be tormented by the same trauma, even if we're part of the same family, which is something that's beautiful. But um, can you remind me the question again, real quick?
The question was the anger side of the anger
Yeah.
phase of grief. Like, how does it relate in the context of the story?
Yeah.
How does it relate communally, and how do we get out?
So, for the context of the story, as a man, I think it presents itself violently, because you're in chapter 3, you have, okay, now I have to come to terms with this. I'm only able to see you this amount of time. It's like, okay, I have to come to terms with it. I can't. There's poems like talking about like I'm devoid of emotion because I haven't allowed myself to feel, and I don't know how to allow myself to feel. It's too painful to process or try and have fun with you, because to try and have fun with you, I have to go through the emotions. Like I have to let that go. I don't want to. So I am devoid of emotion. I'm still. You want to play with, or there's a poem that mentions it in chapter 3. It's like you want to play, but I'm mute. I'm devoid of emotion. So something else happens in chapter 3 that triggers the anger phrase, and it's starts from the poem The Breaking Point, and it ends at the poem, or technically it ends at the poem The Wooden Spoon. And I'll read The Wooden Spoon because I think it deserves to be read, and if anybody has read the book, maybe you'll understand what it means. But The Wooden Spoon reads, "It wasn't a straw, it was an overstepping stranger, a wooden spoon, a confession, a red bottom, and our little girl that made this camel almost kill a man." And the overstepping stranger is a stepdad that is the character that's entered this story. And the red bottom is literally the red bottom of, the niece. So you have this situation where the uncle or the family, really, because it's more of than the uncle, but the uncle is the one you're experiencing the story through. So little niece has been harmed, um, and there's this rage of like, how do I protect our little girl? You know what I'm saying? And the violence, that's really kind of what it bubbles up. These violent thoughts that are about to become actions. And then you have a moment in the book where you realize it's either expressed externally or expressed internally. Either violence on somebody or violence on yourself. And that's I think the emotional tussle that's mentioned in this book in poems like A Cold Steel, to where it's like uncle wanting to get violent, but it's also like I'm just hurting. I'm just hurting. I'm a man and I'm hurting. And nobody necessarily can help. I don't know what to do. I'm also a young man hurting. That's like important because I'm ignorant. I don't know a lot. I don't know how to deal with this situation. What do I do? Am I failing as a family member right now? Am I failing as a man right now? And and there's this battle that's embedded in chapter 2 where he's blaming himself a lot. He's blaming himself for his ignorance. Like, I could have said something, which is very just something we can do when we're dealing with pain, is put the responsibility on ourselves when it was far out of our control. And he does this in this book, like, oh, I could have said something, and it's like, nah, somebody's relationship fell apart that had nothing to do with you, you know. And that's the beauty of kind of the allegory between the niece and the uncle, is like, he's writing this book so she doesn't make the same mistakes. Your parents' relationship had nothing to do with you. And if you internalize that, you're going to get angry and bitter and either hurt somebody that you love or hurt yourself. So that's really, I think, for men, the anger phase can look very violent at times. As a community, the anger phase looks like hurt. It doesn't look like healing. And that's, once again, an intangible, but I want you to imagine what pain feels like. Pain, or not just what pain feels like, what does pain look like? And that's can be physical. That could be a paper cut, that could be you stubbing your toe. What does that moment look like? You pissed off, you know what I mean? Don't even really know what you're pissed off at. Um, but then the healing is when you kind of calm down and try and get yourself together. Let me get a bandage, let me clean the cut. So I'll use that literal analogy to apply it to this emotional situation, or our emotional situation. Getting out of the anger phase just looks like facing whatever hurts you or confronting whatever hurts you and prioritizing cleaning up the mess that whatever hurt you left. Like prioritizing that. Because sometimes you can confront whatever hurts you, and instead of prioritizing cleaning up the mess, you're prioritizing creating a bigger one, trying to get up on the bed you stubbed your toe on. And it's like, you're not going to get anything from that argument, but you will get something from choosing to ice your foot. So I think when it comes to, especially us as a people, us as a culture, when things hurt us and we get stuck in the anger phase. I remember being at a protest when the protests were going on, when George Floyd was killed, and I remember there was a panther, and it was in Dayton, Ohio. There was a panther and there was a lady, and they started getting into an argument because it was supposed to be just a protest. And then we all go home, and the lady's like, "Nah, I'm trying to turn this place upside down." And he's like, "Nah," and they're getting into an argument. And I look right under them, and I'm like, there's a little boy looking at both of them. And I just take the speaker or the megaphone, and I'm like, let's go home. And beyond going home, stop arguing. Like, we're angry, we're hurting, but because we're not dealing with our pain, a little boy is seeing you two arguing, and you don't even know how he's feeling. Like, he's being ignored because of the pain that you're not dealing with. So, a bit of a winded answer, but it deserves its time, because grieving has stages, and we can often be angry, and that's either at somebody else or at ourselves. And that's not a place we should be dishonest with. That's not a place we should be ashamed of, but that's a place that we need to not stay in because it's destructive for real, for real. Like I said, it can be self-destructive, and that's something the book is highlighting, this uncle fear of being violent towards someone else and becoming like hurting people in the process, or being violent towards himself. The book introduces that, like in the prologue. Literally, the first poem mentions like, there was a moment I thought about ending it all, then I thought about you. So yeah,
Yeah.
heavy.
Yeah. When you talked about not knowing what to do, this character, based on you, the brother whose daughter it is, the niece, that brother also raised you, right? And so now it's when you said getting permission, you were getting permission not just from the brother because he was such a key stakeholder in the situation because he's the father of your niece, but in a way you were getting permission from your father. So it's like we had to get permission from an elder to speak, right? And so also when I was listening, you were talking about the red bottom and the niece in the story, her name is Scarlet. And when I look at the cover, I realized throughout there's poetry where you reference her in ladybugs, and she's got a little ladybug backpack here. And then there's a red umbrella, and then there's a red light. And so I wonder if you could tell us something about all these connections with the color red.
Yeah. First of all, I love the cover because it came out perfect. Like I literally, when I put it to the cover designer, like I wrote out the specifics, and I had to get real specific because I didn't know if the cover artist that I got, because I went through a third party, I didn't know if they were black or not. So there's like certain things they might not know when it comes to stuff. So it's like these are locks. It's 3 pictures of the locks I'm looking for. You know what I'm saying? It's cultural differences, but the symbolism is something I rely on heavy with this book, especially when it comes to the representation. So Rush is a poem in chapter 4. What's chapter 1? Chapter 5. Rush is a poem in chapter 5 that pretty much everything is red. If you can read the poem, it's a red poem, literally and figuratively. Well, not literally, but figuratively, because it highlights this rush of feelings. It's one of the poems that's supposed to close the book out, or close the story out in terms of highlighting the rush that you can feel because you're desperate for something in this book. So red can also highlight a sense of desperation in this book, as well as also danger, and more importantly, pausing, like stopping, and that's kind of what the niece, she has a few different symbols. There's a sun. The sun represents her as an entity that brings everybody together and also gives life, ironically. There's the ladybug, which is good fortune, and healing or luck, you know. But that color red is really that pause, that take a moment to pause, to not rush, because the poem Rush, it's supposed to feel like a rush. There's no commas, there's few periods intentionally. There's this consistent just movement, because we all can hit a point, especially when you deal with something as traumatic as this, to feel desperate for love, feel desperate for affection, feel desperate for healing, feel desperate for something. But the reality that's kind of reminded in this entire book is to just stop. So that's kind of what red is. Red is usually used as something ambitious or something very strong, but one of the things that it really is used is as a stop, as a pause, as a reminder not to rush, not to press forward, even if you feel like it. Like the poem where he's dealing with that trauma, that anger phase in chapter 3, where I get the poem from Nina Simone, Blood on the Leaves, Blood on the Sea. And there's this, I envisioned Prince of Egypt really when I was writing that more so. If anybody's watched the movie, and Sea Becomes Red, that's really kind of what I envisioned when I wrote it. My nerve, I mean, there's so much that inspired. But yeah, it's really like red kind of is this reminder to not press forward, even though it can make us feel like when you ever know when somebody says like, "Oh, I saw red," it's like, nah, stop. You know what I'm saying? Um, yeah, now I'm thinking of like just a whole lot of stuff, but I don't want to get lost. That's really.
It's funny you should say that because from your previous interview, I understand you're planning a sequel called When You Get Lost.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit. Obviously you can't, give the whole thing away, but a little bit of what the gist or maybe general direction or energy of that sequel will be.
I mean, the one I'm writing it because I want to try and write more poetry books like this. Like, of course, I want to do some collections that will be more proverbial for people just writing around a theme. But this storytelling, this using poetry as storytelling, I want to challenge myself and try and do that a little bit more. You know what I'm saying? So, When You Get Lost is pretty much, I want to lean heavier into fatherhood. I want to lean heavier into that, which is one, the consequences of us not taking care of and protecting not only fathers, but the idea of fatherhood. I want to lean into the consequences of that. I want to lean into a family that's sacrificing. But the most, I think, important thing is I want to highlight a character um, that has learned their lessons. You know what I'm saying? Has learned their lessons. But I think Jason Wilson said it best. I'm not going to quote it exactly, but the paraphrase is like, you really don't know you really don't know your faith until it's been tested. In chapter or this first book, it really wasn't a testing of faith, it was learning it. So now that you've learned it, and when you get lost, I want to highlight that test. What is the test that really puts you in a situation? And oftentimes in situations, I think where we feel like we know it all and we end up not knowing, like our knowledge gets tested to a point, we feel lost. So not only that being an important thing for people to learn what to do when you get lost, um, that's kind of going to be the premise. And I'm carrying on this idea that is stuck in when you get older, which is it takes a village to raise a child, you know, and the family is going to have to stretch pretty much beyond themselves, like have to realize their family that's suffering. Like, I want to get into the nature of how the family moves as a collective and how communities also take care of families, you know, and I want that to be the lesson that you take away from the struggle that will have to be traversed in when you get lost. So.
Well, I do have some more questions, but I also want to just put out there, we certainly want to have a part where we open the floor to questions from you all. All right, and also we certainly want to have a part where we hear some poetry from you, brother. So I'm gonna just ask one more question so we could, so I want to, y'all be thinking about y'all questions. All right, but as we open the floor for that. There was a part in, okay, the mind is a treasure. There's a part in that poem where you say if you want to understand boys, don't watch them on the court. Don't watch them on the field. Watch them playing with Legos because the answers are in the pieces. Tell us more.
Yeah, so that was highlighting something that's important for the niece, you know, who, as a little girl in spaces where I think I mentioned a poem where it's like, boys, you know what I mean? Boys getting on your nerves, just being boys. And it's like, it's something helpful for her, but it's also talking about the complexity of young boys and young men and how oftentimes we can kind of juxtapose them to being simple. It's like, nah, very complex beings because we're human beings at the end of the day. So it's to turn the narrative on its head to highlight this poetry book is a boy picking up the pieces, you know, and putting himself and the world together and developing a framework of perspective. And that's something to pay attention to because when you look at, I think, something that a lot of boys can develop into when it's like very hands-on with a lot of the activities that you get involved in life, like engineering, for instance. That's uh, you can just overlook boys and young men when you kind of just put an umbrella of simplicity over them and you don't allow yourself to learn. So it's highlighting to her to take opportunities to really learn from the boys in your life. We're the boys as well, because it is just uncles in the book, and realize that it's not the strength is not in the muscle. The strength is in the mind. You know what I'm saying? And you can get lost by thinking it's just the ability to push through five grown men or jump out the building. It's like the mind is what takes somebody far. You know, the mind is where the strength is really residing, the mind and the spirit. So it's to realize what is happening with young boys when they choose to play with Legos and build something. You know what I mean? What is happening and how you can not only learn from that when it comes to your healing process, you know, but learn from that when it comes to finding your strength. Because um, I don't need you to be in a situation where it's like you want to fake being strong. You know what I'm saying? Like, and that's something that we often can do when we're traumatized. Is like put on a front, put on a mask, and it's like, nah, we're hurting. You know what I'm saying? We're hurting, and that's okay. How can you develop your mind, understand your situations? How can you pick up the pieces, and when something's been destroyed, choose to build something that's not a muscle endeavor, that's up here, so that's just something very important that you can learn, and that's something that I really want to do, like as an author, is really empower young men. As I was just talking to my roommate Justin about it Sunday, I think empower, or not empower, I think that's the wrong word, maybe educate, maybe be vulnerable, be honest. um, I don't know, I just think the conversation around poetry for young men, like, it's like a seesaw. It's like, but there's not really straight positivity, especially young black men. It's like it's acceptable to exist as a martyr. It's acceptable to hear like poems about us being carcasses, and tombstones. Like that's normal. Um, but if it's not on that end, we are the abusers. We take advantage of the community. We've hurt somebody. You know what I'm saying? And I just think it doesn't take into the complexities of men being human beings. It turns us into caricatures, and that's something that I want to do with my poetry. With that honesty, is really not set an example, but tell honest stories. You know what I'm saying? That makes you change your perspective on human beings. You know what I'm saying? Like the father in this story, who you kind of really have to empathize with. I don't really characterize them, but if you see what the uncle's going through, you can imagine what a father's going through. You know what I'm saying? As well as the health problems that are the undertone happening in the background of this story, with the father, which will further expound in When You Get Lost. Um, and the way that I put it into perspective is look up to Malcolm X a lot and study his work a lot. And he had an interview where the interviewer asked him, like, do you consider yourself radical? And he was like, nah, I consider myself Malcolm. And I find that line so beautiful because it's like, nah, I'm not an ideal. I'm a human being. You know what I'm saying? I may express my feelings strongly. I may express them unapologetically, but I'm more than this caricature, this statue, or this idol you're trying to make me. I'm just a human being. And that's something that I think a lot of men will have to learn, because with mistakes that other men make, you can find yourself overcompensating and either hating yourself, you know what I'm saying, or not being honest and genuine with the people around you because you're afraid of taking action, to the point to where you become a shadow of the wall or a shadow of yourself. You know what I'm saying? So, with that poem that you brought up, that I think does a good job with highlighting what you can learn from little boys, not even grown men, what you can learn from little boys, what's happening in the psychology. I think that's something that I hope my poetry does inspire. And I have primarily black women in the audience right now, and that's something that also I think y'all need as well. When it comes to seeing us in not different lights, but honest lights, and seeing us as humans that you also can lean on. And this story is somebody that you can learn from as well, that you can look at as a brother, as somebody that has had to find inner strength, and it can also put a mirror on you or maybe people that because technically the antagonist of this story is a mother, so what is the story being told with that? What is the honest lens that you would have to put on that may not be the most comfortable to look at, but if you choose to dive into this story, are you able to look at it? And the mother and the mage, I think that opens up the final chapter, or the second to last chapter, is one of those honest poems to where it's like, okay, we're about to look at this, and let's talk about the elephant in the room more, so.
Mm. And that's why I said what I said about the super fan, because I don't want anybody to read the book and then find where the mother lives. It's like,
Yeah, nah.
but pitchforks and torches out here. But it is a resonant story. It is one that so many people will relate to. That's why I wanted to find its audience truly, because there's so many things in addition to all the insights that you just shared with us about Black men healing, Black boys healing, Black families healing. In this poetry, beyond the style, which is strong, there is a story, a narrative, a dynamic that needs to be explored more in many communities. So I thank you for being so open and honest with it. With that, I want to now see if you are ready to. With our dealer's choice, would you prefer to first take some questions from the audience, or first, both are happening, but first share some perms for us, if you will.
I think the poem should happen first because it may also inspire a question.
Uh-huh.
So kind of take a little bit of pressure off y'all. I'm gonna start backwards. I'm gonna start with I'm gonna finish the poem I read earlier. I'm just pick some of my favorites. That's how we're gonna go about it. I feel very comfortable in this setting, so I'm just pick some of my favorites. So the first poem that I read was Baptized in Fire. And I'm gonna explain some of these a little bit, so I won't do too many unless requested. But so Baptized in Fire. You taught me how to pray. It was the only thing I knew that kept you close when others kept us far. Perhaps this truth is blasphemous, but this truth is more important than sacrilege. I need you to know. My faith was filled with maggots, smelled of embalming solutions coating a weeping corpse. Ashes, urns, and abandoned churches below living temperature thresholds. And this casket of an existence was once my absolute truth. They say there is power in the tongue. So one day I exercised this muscle and learned that there's a fireplace, a warm memory encoded through language where God, haven't said that in a while, communes with strangers like it was his Last Supper. Believing in something greater than death, believing in our ascension. Some say there's power in belief. Truth is, I don't really know yet, but I believe in you, so maybe it is true. Just the last chapter is just, oh my God, I love it. It rounds out the story really well, but I'm not going to do every one from the last chapter. I'm going to do Cinderella's Broken Foot. I may come back to Ancestral Echoes because I do think it's important to read. I wish there was like some young princesses in the crowd, because I feel like that one's really empowering for them. But this one is very important. It's called Cinderella's Broken Foot. I'm going to go ahead and read it. It's one of my favorite. I'm going to talk about how I wrote it. But Cinderella's Broken Foot. She fears her sisters in the wall, becoming a horrendous woman. This gorgeous child then committed to an eternity of walking on glass. Trauma refracting through footprints, perhaps survivals enduring inside a flask. The ladies throw stones on her way to church, yet she fears her sisters in the wall. Princes beg her to heal. The shoe does not fit. She wears it, fears becoming the sisters in the wall. Lady Liberty despises injustice. She breaks the sword of her tongue, moving to a glass house with her sisters in the wall. Feet blistered and bruised, a rolled ankle shatters her soul. Tears withdraw, won't cry, not by the sisters in the wall. A medic brings stitches. She asks, can he fix a glass shoe? Wear it or burn it, he says. You are not your sisters in the wall. So I'm gonna do a quick explanation of that. I really love that poem so much. One, because when I wrote it, like I wrote the draft and then I went to my apartment window and I just looked out the window and I thought, and I came back. And I think anybody that's a writer, editing process, don't give up. You know what I'm saying? Don't feel like it has to be perfect on the first try. I had like 5 personal drafts before I even send it to editing. So I love this poem because the premise of this poem is to not allow who came before you or who's a part of you to define you. You know what I'm saying? So especially as a young girl, I use I use the sisters as as an allegory for the niece's mother in this case. But you know, the sisters were pretty abusive in the story Cinderella. So how can a girl like take what people are saying about you and let them be in every part of your life? So now because she's afraid of being like her sisters, she's committed an eternity to walking on glass. Um, She's afraid of speaking up. She's afraid of defending herself. So when somebody says, takes her hand, she squeezes into this shoe that she doesn't even fit in. When Lady Liberty despises injustice, she breaks the sword of her tongue. She doesn't defend herself because defending herself can make her view herself as violent versus you having a right to autonomy, you having a right to your body. So she moves into a glass house. Like it grows from a shoe to an entire house to where her sisters are in the wall. Her trauma is everywhere around her. Feet blistered and bruised, a rolled ankle shatters her soul. Tears withdraw, she won't even cry. She fears, or not by the sisters in the wall. She can't even be vulnerable with herself because her trauma is all around her. So she won't even cry. And then, a medic brings stitches to fix her foot. And she asks, can he fix a glass shoe? And he's like, wear it or burn it. You are not your sisters in the wall. And if there's anybody in your life, especially family members or parents that, have hurt you and you commit your life to trying not to be like them, it is a burden that you don't have to wear. You don't have to wear that glass shoe. If it looks good, go ahead. You know what I mean? But you don't have to wear it. You can be your own person. And that's something that, the niece in this story needs to learn, especially as a young girl whose mother is kind of the foundation of her trauma. It's like you want to grow beyond that because since that is maybe who you idolize just coming out the womb as your pinnacle of womanhood, and it may not be the most healthy space. Like, how can you develop your own individuality and identity? So I love that poem. That poem is one of my favorites. Uh, I feel like I should do Rush since I mentioned it, but I don't know. There's so many. Let's go to questions while I'm thinking. Yes, I had a question in here while I'm thinking.
Questions.
I have a question. So you asked the question originally about trauma, and your answer talked about how when you go through trauma, it can sometimes block your emotions or block how you're able to interact with the world. So being both a writer and a person, and having your story be like fictional but real at the same time, how do you feel that writing has helped you to unplug some of those emotional barriers? And do you think that it also came about, or do you feel like you had to release whoever you were at that time to get on the other side of it, to be willing to play or to let loose?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Deep as always. I kind of answered this a little bit on my Instagram, but there's another part of it that you added that I want to dive into. So, there's a video I put up on my Instagram which talks about truth and artistry, to where I think it's very helpful because as a writer, we can feel like if we're not immediately hurt by that story, like we'll abandon it because it's like we have to be or we're so used to, like, at least when it comes to poetry. Like I remember one of my first poems that I was like, okay, this is kind of good, was like a heartbreak. I was hurt and I just wrote. So when you're used to your art coming from such an honest place, you can feel like it's dishonest when you're not writing from that immediate pain. But there's still stories that deserve to be told, regardless if you heal or not. So you really have to have faith in the art, have faith in the poetry, and let that guide you because it's kind of instinctual. So when it comes to writing this book, um, it's interesting. It helped me heal because it helped me understand how I was feeling about a lot of things. Even though I kind of already had the understanding, I just was now able to put it in words. Um, but the beauty of it is that it helped me with knowing how I claim victory over my own story and also give the readers a sense of victory when reading this book. It's like it's not all somber and sorrow. It's like you get something from reading this book. You get an uncle that reconnects with his faith, and through him reconnecting with his faith, he's able to reconnect with his niece, and that's the victory that you experience in this book. So to add also personally, there are times where I'm going through something, and this book is the reminder I need. So it's so beautiful how you have the power to heal yourself in ways. And that, I think, is a spiritual thing. I don't think you can rationally explain it in any type of way. I think it really is like, I don't know, your God consciousness taking a hold of you and you trusting yourself to kind of be your own liberator at times. So there's certain poems in here where, hey, somebody may have me messed up, you know what I mean? Or I may be dealing with some things, and I'm like, I remind myself that I faced this before, or I remind myself that there's a story about this, and let me not repeat the same mistakes that I not only taught other people but taught myself. But there is a danger with that, because that can put a pressure on you to feel like you can't make those mistakes again. So that's where you have to be careful if you write a personal book. Because especially if you're in the limelight, dang, what if somebody sees me get out of character about a situation where I wrote this entire book? It's like, nah, you're not being true to your word. And it's like, nah, I'm human. You know what I'm saying? But we're not, I guess we are performers in some instance, but at least the way I approach art and the way I would talk to any artist is I don't want any artist to be a slave to the audience. Even if you're a performer, you're doing them a service, but they're also doing you a service participating. There's this beautiful exchange that's happening. So the danger, though, of writing that personal book is when you're in the limelight, allowing the pressure to get to you and feel like, dang, nah, I can't make this mistake again. It's like, nah, you can. You have the power to write this that potentially helped somebody else from making a mistake. You know, so answer to that question. I'm gonna go ahead and fill in with a poem, and I'm going to go into Family Trees Part 2. There's so many poems in here, like I really don't know, but I'm gonna read the ones that I haven't really read before. So Family Trees Part 2. Time is a mandate. Love is a choice. It is the exodus, the letting my people go. It is a blind man returning home. It is a parent's embrace after your crude day. Love truly is the faith and the finding. Maybe other families live as beautiful gardens, but I believe trees choose the ground in which they grow. I believe these bonds are rooted deeper than seeds. It shakes the earth between our toes. It seeps into the hearts of our dearest friends. It can come alive on the pages of books, and it can even outlast a lifetime. Maybe other families live as beautiful gardens, but I believe this love is built differently, built like the tree. I believe this love lasts longer. I'll open it up again. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I've got to get back into this cover because it's beautiful. And also the title.
I don't know if everybody's already seen it or read it.
Cover?
Yeah, I probably got the Instagram and everything, but I just.
Nah, I appreciate you.
But I'm also really big on symbolism, so I love the fact that you already addressed the color, like the red little pops of it around. But I want to talk about like how the title also corresponds with the fact that I normally need one. Okay, that the title corresponds with you holding the umbrella over her, and it's when you get older, because I feel a lot of times with Black girls, especially because of the adultification of Black youth, we're a lot of times not allowed childhood, and because of the trauma that exists in our family, whether it be generationally or whether it be in your like immediate family, as you know, your nieces, this immediate situation, you're not often, your childhood isn't preserved. And I feel like to me, the umbrella, I mean, you can of course correct me if I'm wrong. I'm kind of asking like, is that what you intended when you also titled it? Because you're talking about all these like traumatic things that happen and you're going through all this emotion, but the book is indicated for her to get old when she's older. So it's almost as if you know all of this is going on, but you're still allowing her to be a child. Like even the presentation of her with the two pink puffs, I think that is one of the most little girlish, like hairstyles, the ladybug book bag, the raincoat. I think that's one of like the yellow raincoat, very, akin to childhood and everything. And then the striped leggings, all of that is very childlike. And so it feels like when you're holding like the umbrella over her, you're preserving that childhood even from like all the stuff that's going on, because that tends to be taken away from black children.
Yeah. 100%. So yes, very intentional about that because so there's two ways I'm going to answer this question. It's one being this protective figure, and I don't know if I did change anything about it, I wouldn't, but I almost would make the I just got an idea, but I almost would make the uncle more of like ghost-like figure, because not necessarily present, but even without presence, finding ways to protect you and protect your innocence, protect your youth. That's kind of this thing, and yeah, it really is a when you get older. So you inspired two poems that I'm gonna read next, which answer your question, which is one of the things in this book. It is preserving your youth. It is how do you heal and not take on the battles that will turn you into that'll make you want to adult too fast, especially in this, which is the difficult part that is emotional. I think if you really dive into the book and you look outside of the uncle in chapter 4, when the uncle and the niece are now experiencing each other, you're realizing that she's also she's feeling this, maybe not internal or interpreting it the same way, but almost the same. Like they're both, there's a poem titled The Here's Redemption Arc, which I'll read, where they're both trying to play games all night, have fun all night, stay up all night, just do these things. And you could think it's a beautiful moment, but it's also kind of sad because she knows Sunday I have to go. Like Sunday I have to go. So she's trying to put a week or all this missed time into a little moment. And you, at least up to this point, you probably think it's just them, saving gifts and going through this, but you also realize she's being affected by this storm, which is an important symbolism, this rain. So it's like, how do you protect her from the rain? And that's the beautiful thing about this family that I really want. Like, I want these books to also reinstill our values as family, but also add some new ones. Like, I want this family to be a family that people can say like, hey, read this book because there's stuff you can learn about how to be better for your people. And this is like how to take care of your kids, and protect her youth, because you don't have to know everything. And I'm gonna personalize this because this is Sankofa and I can do this and I can be personal. I dealt with some stuff this year that that tested that, to where I remember somebody asking me about the book, and it was just personal. It was about my family. And one of the things that I said was, you know, oftentimes because of what we've been through, I can forget that she's, a young girl, like a little kid. But I'm always going to remind myself because you deserve to be a kid. Like, you don't have to, I don't care if you know it, just because what's happened has shaped you to think a certain way. Like, I'm always going to give you the benefit of the doubt of being a kid. I'm always going to have certain underestimations, because you deserve that. You don't have to know how to take care of all this. I don't expect you to. And that's not to underestimate your competence. That's to not put an unnecessary pressure on you to have to fix or figure out this world. Like, that's our responsibility. And responsibility, I guess, is something that is learned. That's why that love is a choice. That's something that is a question. What is love? I asked that question in the first poem of this book, like, what is love? And you really have to learn love is a choice. We're choosing to stay, and you're our reminder of love. Like, you are the reminder that we're going to choose to stay in this rain. Don't matter if I get wet, umbrella is for you. You know what I'm saying? And we'll clean ourselves up. So great question. which leads me to a poem I'm going to read in chapter 4. Highlights exactly 2. So, where are you? You're right here. Life's full of circles. Great poem. That's a long book. I'm proud of it. All right, so life's full of circles. When you ask for my age, I joke. I tell you I'm 85. Strangers often believe I'm 30. Sometimes me thinks I'm 24. But the truth is, I'm 23. The term growing up fast floats around often. I find more kids inheriting adult responsibilities every day. Children surviving and thriving on their ability to adapt. Daughters raising their mother's household. Sons working graveyard shifts to save an addict. Your father leaving school to raise me. In the absence of our parents at 19, he became Dad. Growing up too fast. I am 23. These circumstances are born from particular scarcity, teaching the youth to thrive upon necessity. Sometimes we'll live too fast, dying too soon. Little rabbits racing the tortoise of time. It follows too. I am 23. Maybe hard lessons whooped me wiser than most, but metabolism slows, responsibility grows, people become variable. Over time, too little too late, people change. I'm 23, and I'll only be 13 once, a time when smiles didn't come with a price. I'll only be 17 once, a time of writing poems for prom dates. I'll only be 18 once, a time when I was a fresh face in a new place. I'll only be today once, a time when I often remind myself to slow down. I am 23. One more around that theme. Don't worry, I'm gonna get to you. I'm gonna just get this one out the way. It has to do with what she was talking about. It's titled "Here's Redemption Art." This might be my favorite one. This is tough. All right. I'm aware that we should, but just like you, we can't slow down. Our eyes meet only 2 sunrises every week, a trigger springing us into 2-a-day activities. Our race against lost time. Funneling enthusiasm into this hourglass, we share gifts from missed birthdays, exchange stories under a star's gaze. We play games until the moon is weary. Another 187 days. We never know how long next time will be, or if there will be a next time. So we sprint, we dash, we hurdle over exhaustion, persevering through our regrets. And I know we should cut our losses. I know that we should stop. But it's as if my brakes were gone, and just like you, we can't slow down. That poem.
Wow.
Yeah. Would you like the microphone?
This is so unfair.
I can come
Try-
right to you.
No, I can speak loud. You don't have to come.
Appreciate
To try to think of my one of many questions I have, and you read different poems. I had questions when you started. Then I came in late. First, I want to say thank you. You used the word empowered, like you said. You don't know if you should use that word, but at the time that I came in and what I heard you share, at my age, I know for certain that what you have written will be empowering for women, for girls, little girls. So I'll still say that, and educational for boys and men. So I wanted to say that.
Thank
I have a question, comment. I was wondering if the onset of you writing this particular piece, did you start off with it being told in a story or separate pieces? Did you know for certain that you wanted the poems to be a story?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that was a simple question.
Now you're good. I'm gonna expound on it more, but I'll let you get your question.
Let me fair. This will be my last question comment. Oh, as you was explaining the birth of each piece that you wrote, me as a young artist, I'm 52, but I'm a young artist. I started writing maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I was writing to save my life. I didn't know that at the time, but I was actually like, it was therapy for me. So when I go back and read them, as you said, is to remind me, and I'm okay if I make that same mistake. The question I have, I'm at the point of wanting to share because I believe somebody will be empowered and somebody will be educated. Do you include in your book explaining the birth of that piece? And I ask that because I realized for me, because it's such an art, you have a better chance of being empowered by what I'm sharing if I explain to you the birth of it and, you know, the inspiration of it.
Yes, ma'am.
Will you ever do that? Did you do that in that book? I didn't open it yet. And all the poems all the books of poems I've read, especially Cotton Candy, that's one of my favorites because it was my mom's favorite. I can't even think of the poet's name. Who wrote Cotton Candy?
I'm not familiar.
She's an older poet. But anyway, if I could understand what she was writing or what inspired her, I would probably fall in love with her writing like my mom did.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel like before I produce mine or share it with the world, I have to explain it so that you can be encouraged the way I was healed when I wrote it.
So I'm gonna expound on your first question first. It was whether I wrote with the intent. So the way that my process started off was there was a writing. There was like a writing prompt where they wanted a poetry manuscript, and I wrote chapter 3 of this book, which was a manuscript, but it wasn't random. I wanted the poems to layer on top of each other because it was the first time I was writing and submitting a project or even writing an extended set of poems, and I wanted it to lay on top of each other like a story. So it was written with that intent, but once again, I had personally, before I even had some friends read it, go back and edit it, and then sent it to a professional editor, I had like 5 drafts of my own, to where there were poems in chapter 1 that I moved to chapter 3 because it fit better there for the story. There were poems in chapter 4 I moved up. So it didn't flow as good of it didn't flow as eloquently as a story before. So it felt like a bit of a collection, a little bit. But I always wrote with the intent that this is going to be a story unraveling. To answer your second question, highlighting the sharing, I was actually suggested that. I was suggested from my audiobook to do a interview, which I might still do. I'd have to talk with the company I'm trying to go through, but was talked about doing an interview to where at the end of every chapter, like I'm explaining kind of these poems because they are written very there's this code, there's this poetry, there's this this Egyptian kind of hieroglyphic way that you're reading poems. And I'll say this from an artist's perspective. I think you can run into a danger wanting to be understood too much. And I only say that because you deserve the grace of your art breathing and somebody doing the work to understand you. You know what I'm saying? Like, because once again, I always say it is a privilege somebody experiencing your artwork. And that shouldn't be taken for granted. And you can fall into kind of maybe a Mandela effect or imposter syndrome when, there's the intense desire for your art to be understood. So I would recommend revisiting the intent of explaining certain poems to where, like, Cinderella's Broken Foot, I know that might go over a lot of heads, but I'm really explaining it because it's one of my favorite poems that I enjoy. Like, I enjoy going back and revisiting, and it is an important piece, that idea, that creative idea. So it's one of those things where I don't think you need to, but if you feel like it adds to what you're trying to accomplish, then I wouldn't hold you back from that. But you really want to revisit the reason that you're going for something, because you may be latching yourself onto a desire that might not serve you down the long run, because it requires so much acceptance that comes outside of yourself, and the acceptance inside of yourself is very fundamental. I always say, write selfishly, share selflessly, because write selfishly so that you're being honest and true to your work, and then when you share, it's like letting go of a baby. You got to send them to school, and the world's going to interact with them despite of how much you love them inside your home. You know what I'm saying? So I highly recommend kind of approaching it like that, raising something.
I love that.
Yeah.
And
Appreciate
then we
you.
would miss out on this right here as writers if we gave too much.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
I appreciate you. Peace on to you. You know what I'm saying? For real. Yeah, I got another poem, but let's open up the questions.
She has a question.
Yes,
I have a
ma'am,
question.
please.
Can you hear me? I'm very soft spoken.
So you might want to.
Yeah.
Bring it. Yeah, no problem.
I might
I
actually.
can't give her my love.
No, I know. Okay, amazing. Thank you. As like an avid lover of poetry and like words as an art form, poetry is such like a raw and personal thing. Like especially when you're telling a story that you're emotionally invested in and that's like therapeutic for you, and like you go through a journey at the start of it and at the end of it. Like it's just a whole process of like learning more about yourself and learning more about what you're writing. And so I guess I'm wondering like when you're writing something that's so personal and you're wanting to do the story justice and you're wanting to do the art justice, like how do you decide what to keep and what to let go? Because I know you can never tell like a perfect story, but I think within every poet there is this, you kind of have a sense, it's like this intuition where like I know this poem is done, I know the kid is ready to go to school now. And I think for me that's so hard to discern because it's like it is so personal and you do want to get it just right. And there's some poems when, especially if you're trying to create like a poetry book that tells a story, you're like, oh, I really think this needs to be in there, but you don't have that sort of objective point of view where it's like, well, maybe you actually pull that thread in a later poem because you wrote this one and you can kind of keep this one in the drafts to yourself. But it's just so hard to let go of because again, you're so like emotionally and psychologically invested. So I guess that's my question is like, practically what was the editing and publishing process like, but also emotionally, like what made this story complete for you?
Yeah. Great question. Great, phenomenal question. I think I'll answer I want to commend you first because I think the important part, I try, which I think is evident kind of in the characterization of this book, understanding something helps me bond with it more. So it's hard for me to just blindly follow something I don't understand really. And that goes into writing as well. I constantly am doing like studies on the idea of writing. What separates poetry from spoken word? What separates poetry from writing an essay? What separates Langston Hughes' Mother to Son from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech? You know what I'm saying? What makes it a poem? So good questions to ask, good thoughts to have that makes the mind work, which is very necessary. It can feel tiring, but very necessary. And I commend you because the intuition and the instinct, I think, is what makes something art, is what separates it from some of our practical things, like what separates creative writing from just your standard essays or research work. It's like there's intuition, there's instinct. You're not fully relying on a form, you're practicing something until it really becomes instinctual and you no longer can really define it because it's become personal and an extension of yourself, which is very beautiful. So to kind of answer the question on the editing process, I mean, I've touched on it before to where I finished it. And the way that I went about it writing is before I even started the book, because I'm even kind of doing the similar thing now with this new book, is I had the list of chapters that I wanted to write. And so every chapter I embarked upon, I knew what story I wanted to tell. and I had the list of poems that would tell that story. It's easy because it came from a very real place. What makes this next book difficult is there's less of those real places that this story is coming from. So I really have to define what the entire book is. You know what I mean? Like, what's the goal and what are these chapters accomplishing? So, and then you have the editing process, and my professional editor was amazing. So there's two forms of editing that you can get. There's developmental editing, and there's I'm gonna just say grammatical editing, which is you can get it grammatically edited, or you can get your story like edited, and somebody can really read it and be like, nah, this, how does this connect to this? One thing that my editor did really well, he was like, yo, you did this here that really works well with what you're trying to do. You should probably repeat that here. And even the last poem, When You Get Older, like he really helped with like, this should feel like, because you're writing it like there's a story, like it should feel, the reader should feel things coming full circle. So instead of letting your metaphors be so ambiguous, like maybe connect it to parts of your book. So like the end of the last poem, like there's connections to this poem, this poem, this poem, this title, this title, this title, until you get to finally find us when you get older, you know? So like the editing process, it really, or the way that you're able to kind of close out things is having those goals, which was easy for me because once again, it came from a real place. So I knew in this story, in chapter 1, I want to talk about childbirth and set up the upcoming demise. In chapter 2, I want to stick with the sadness and what's happening, which I also made chapter 2 the longest intentionally because I wanted to try and make it feel exhausting, you know, for the reader to go through. So, you know, there are those like things that you have to think of, like that goal setting, which you can kind of want to separate yourself from as an artist because you can feel like this is compromising the emotion, you know, the ambiguity of everything or the authenticity, and it's like, nah, this is just you being intentional, and more serious about the thing that you want to create, and that is should be appreciated. So please, like, let me know more if I'm like hitting on if I'm hitting on the question exactly. But I do think at least that general point of how I approached it in the editing is something touched on. But let me know if
No, that's really helpful. I think what I struggle with is like, okay, I feel safe sharing this too because I feel like this is an okay environment, even though I'm like new here. But for me, I think because I write from a very like emotional place and I know that there's a specific story I'm trying to tell, but at the same time the narrative is really ambiguous because there's so much material. Because sometimes I'm thinking about like generational trauma and what I've inherited, and then my own trauma, and then like my present day life and my relationships. And so I think you talking about the structure and having a very specific event with really specific people that you're recounting through the form of poetry is really helpful because in my mind it's kind of just like a network of intersectional things that have happened throughout the course of my life, and it almost has no beginning or end because they're all affecting one another. And so it feels like I don't know how to write this story anymore. I just know how to write poems that feel honest to me. But you also want to relay that story with clarity and intention, like you were saying. So I think the structure piece is really helpful.
yeah, and I think it depends on how you approach it because you can approach that entire thing from the collection perspective to where it's a collection around this theme. So when you pick up this book, you're reading around this theme. But if you do approach it from the storytelling perspective, you have to, I guess, figure out what is the message that I'm trying to deliver. And then those themes lay on top of each other as like this contributes to telling that message. So, yeah. First of all, I appreciate you, by the way, sharing about your art. I'm gonna see if there's one more poem. I want to get in another question. I'm really like, I can do this all day, but we can't do this all day. So, honestly, if there's any more questions, like, please, shoot. Justin, I'm gonna pick on you. I know you got a question, bro, but we're gonna hold you. My roommate, my guy. But any other questions? Yes,
I
ma'am.
have a comment.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
There's so many that you read that I had comments about, but the one that's sticking with me is the one I think you titled "Stop." Is that the first poem or one of the first poems?
You said stop?
Is it Stop?
Rush.
Oh, Rush.
Yes, ma'am.
Rush. That poem, that piece is so vital to, I would say, communities across the board, not just African American communities, but humans, people, period. Because the first thing that we do, especially after or in the midst of going through trauma, is to keep it moving. That's been my motto. I teach my grandchildren that. He was just traumatized at the playground. And so my mantra that got me through, I'm passing erroneously to him. Keep it moving, but no, stop. And I just want to say, so many, especially females, because males, y'all tend to have things that y'all can gravitate to, and females, we kind of left out here sometimes, especially in the summertime, trying to figure out, what we want to do with our free time. I done lost my point rambling on.
You good.
But I want to share your book with as many young girls as possible. I'm a 30-year retired teacher from DCPS, so I'm speaking from experience. I know how empowering that book is. Just with knowing that it is okay to sit in your grief or to sit with your trauma. There's no right or wrong of managing your trauma. The world taught us, especially females, to keep it moving. Help that black man, help your sister, help your mother, help, but never to help yourself. So thank you.
No, I appreciate you. Thanks. That just reminded me, we didn't touch on that engineering question.
How about that?
yeah.
The question was, I know. No, yeah. You're a mechanical engineer, and I wonder when you talk about world building, how do you compare the world building of that craft with the world building of this craft?
Yeah, so the way that I approach, I guess I kind of already answered it. It helps me with not being too dramatic about the art. And that sounds weird, but it's just like one of those things. It helps me with answering the question of, do I have to be emotionally downtrodden to write about a sensitive part of my life? Like, I guess because you approach engineering from, I want to say, a practical perspective, but that's kind of I think underselling the innovation that requires and the creativity that's required being an engineer. Because I have to approach problems like that from such a perspective, I'm just able to compartmentalize better and not want things to get too messy and convoluted. And sometimes convoluted works for people, sometimes being in the mess is where people thrive best. Not me, you know what I mean? I can, but the way that I deal with the mess is putting it into boxes, cubbies. When we were kids, we had our cubbies. So I'm able to, because of that engineering perspective, and there's just another layer, even when it comes to looking at the world. I've been working with space technology for the past year as a study. So even how I'm able to look at the world now and connect that, even when it comes to culture and the stories that I'm building, it develops your imagination. So I guess I would challenge anybody to just explore, because I think all engineering does is give you the privilege to explore more in life, and whatever you explore more in life influences what you write, or influences the ability you have to tell a story. So if you're traveling, just connect the pieces. And I guess that's engineering, connecting the pieces that may not even fully go together. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, maybe this is your space tech. This is what you built to help you get closer to the sun. So,
Yeah, word. Go ahead, poet.
I'm speaking on your poetry.
Yeah, man. It really is one of those things that I think is going to be very valuable, especially for the books I write in the future. Just having that kind of foundation as an engineer, because I'm passionate about it. It's not one of those things. I struggle with being the person that just does something I'm not cool with. It's one of those things where it's I really think being a part of both of these being connected to me, and I want to connect it to our folks. You know what I'm saying? So, Yeah. Yeah. I think this good spot.
You got
Yeah,
one last poem for us. You sounded like you wanted to read one more.
Yeah, I can do one more. I've been in between. I feel like Rush. I probably should do Rush because we've mentioned that a few times. Like I said, this place is like a family centered place for me, so I've just kind of allowed myself to just be with poems. So I'm gonna go ahead and do Rush. I should have done The Mother and the Mage, but that'll just be y'all homework. Read The Mother and the Mage. Oh, you know what? Oh, another homework. Y'all gonna have to read Rush. This is for our sisters in here. I'm gonna read the last poem in chapter 5, and it's called Dear Rapunzel. So we'll do that. Your hair is too stubborn for those castle walls. Too thick, too stuffy. Where it is not where it should be. The strands through your scalp come from an ancient riddle of rising above and extending beyond. My dear Rapunzel, you should know this story was never a blank page. It was always stained with color. This ruin is what made it perfect. When you look outside of your barred windows, don't starry skies resemble your story? A black sea stained with bright lights. Isn't it beautiful? One day you'll take your place where you belong amongst this Milky Way, flying on the clouds of your hair that was never meant for a castle without doors, was meant for the suns and the moons, meant for the Neptunes and the Jupiters, for the nebulas and the supernovas, meant to fly, my little starlight, meant to fly. End off that. Appreciate y'all. Yeah, this is great. Thank you for everybody that supported. This has actually been a great start of my author career. Like, I really appreciate everybody. Like, there's folks that I don't know that are here that are just enjoying it, and I appreciate you. Appreciate Sankofa. Just being a home for me, away from home since I've been here. Just the cultures, these books, like, it's just love. Like, people underestimate, or not underestimate, try and make black love something that it's not, but it's really welcoming. Like, it's really welcoming. It feels strong. It feels like the sun, but the sun heals, and that's what this space is. So I appreciate just everybody here for sure. Give yourselves a round of applause.
Keep it going for Gabriel, guys. Oh, they are awesome.
Thank y'all for coming out. This was amazing. I already knew that, but
Oh goodness. Okay. So we can't walk out with the book.
so unfortunately, because certain people decided to publish with Amazon, it's fine. I was happy for a little shake. Amazon did not print the books on time and send them on time, but we have the internet, so you can order it off our website. You can either have it picked up here or you can send it directly to your house. Either way, and if you get it here tonight, we can get Gabriel to sign these for you so you can stick it in your book.
Leave a review if you read the book too, like, please.
Please do. Thank y'all so much for coming out. Buy the book on our website, sankofa.com.
Yeah, for sure. Hey man, I appreciate you. Absolutely. Let me sign.